Let's begin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our program tonight, Law and Community in the Battle Against Hate. This program is being co-sponsored by multiple organizations, the Asian American Bar Association of New York, the New York City Bar Association, and the New York State Bar Association. CLE is being offered for experienced attorneys, that's 2 years or more of practice, by AABANY, the Asian American Bar Association. And so I have a few preliminary announcements just to read at the beginning of this program for that purpose. The Asian American Bar Association of New York is certified by the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board as an accredited provider. This program has been approved in accordance with the requirements of the CLE board for a maximum of 1.5 credit hours, in which all 1.5 credit hours will be applied toward the diversity and inclusion requirement. This program is suitable for non-transitional New York attorneys only. Transitional New York attorneys will not receive credit and need not submit the paperwork, but which is welcome, of course, to enjoy our program. You must have pre-registered and confirmed for this program to receive CLE credit. The first page of the written materials that were emailed to you are an attorney affirmation, which you must complete and return to cle@abany.org. 2 codes will be announced during the program. Record the codes on the attorney affirmation, and please return your affirmation as soon as possible, within 1 week, so that we can send you your certificate. You received a link for an online evaluation of this session with the written materials. Please kindly complete that evaluation so we can continue to improve our programming. This program is being recorded for archival purposes. Your continued attendance in this program constitutes consent to transmit, record, and use your voice and image for this purpose. And with that, I'd like to turn this program over to Brett Parker, the Executive Director of the New York City Bar Association, for a welcome message.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks so much to AABANY for organizing this program. Thanks so much to State Bar for being a co-sponsor. And thanks to all of you for being here, because that's the first step, is showing up. And so I'm really happy to be here. AABANY has been such a leader, not just on this issue, but on so many issues. And we're really happy to be a partner with them and with all of you. Sheila Boston, City Bar President, couldn't be here, but she sends her greetings, and she would be she'd be very angry with me if I did not mention that the theme is for the City Bar this year is the Bar of Hope, which is particularly relevant here because the topic of this law and community and the battle against hate, I mean, that is something that we have together. The law and being lawyers and our community, and coming together, we're going to be much stronger than what we're fighting against. So I don't want to take up more airtime. I'm really happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thanks again for letting us be a co-sponsor. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Karen King, I believe, or to Karen Yao.
I think I get to take over at this point. I'm Karen Yao. I have the honor of being the moderator this evening. I am a civil and workers' rights lawyer by the day. And in all my free time, I am a board director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York and am a member of the task force that AABANY has established to fight anti-Asian hate. And so it is my privilege tonight to introduce to you the 5 panelists that we have. So first, we have Karen King, who is my partner in crime, so to speak. Both us, Karen, are very deeply involved in pro bono work. And Karen is a partner at Morvello Abomnowitz, a commercial litigation boutique. She has over 20 years of experience in handling a wide variety of complex commercial disputes. The second person I would like to introduce is Christopher Kwok. Chris is another partner in crime. Both of us have been involved in a lot of different activities together on behalf of AABANY. Chris is a mediator with the private company, really the premier mediation and arbitration firm, GEMS now, after having worked for nearly 2 decades at the EOC office as the alternative dispute resolution coordinator. And then I would like to introduce you to Myrna Martinez Santiago. Myrna is the founder and executive director of Girls Rule the Law. She has had more than 25 years of legal experience handling a range of matters, and she is also an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. And then I would like to introduce you to Kin Eng. Kin Eng is currently a bureau chief at the Kings County District Attorney's Office. He is in charge of the Blue Zone Trial Bureau. He has been with the office for almost 30 years and been in too many positions for me to name, so I won't try. But his the details of his work is in the bio that we have shared with you. And lastly, I would like to introduce you to Janveen Wong, who is an attorney with the COP Accountability Project with the Special Litigation Unit at the Legal Aid Society. The COP Accountability Project, or CAP, works to improve police accountability and transparency across New York City by advocating against problematic police policies and advocating for greater transparency. So thank you very much. We have 5 distinguished panelists who is often sought after to speak. And so we're particularly delighted that all 5 of you are able to join us tonight. I'm going to begin with Karen Kang, who is the co-executive editor, along with Chris Kwok, of A Rising Tide of Violence, which is a report published by AABANY in mid-February. And Karen is going to give us a very brief overview of the rise in anti-Asian hate that coincide with the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, and give us a little bit of background about why it is happening now, or why it's happening again now. Karen? Karen, you're on mute.
Great, thank you so much, Karen Yao. As you mentioned, Chris and I are the co-executive editors of a paper that AABANY published this past February, right before the Lunar New Year. It was a many month-long project to document the rise of anti-Asian hate and incidents across the country. Really, the purpose of it was to make sure people were aware that this was happening, to document it so that it would be remembered, and to analyze some of the root causes and potential solutions to this very disturbing trend. And so as Karen just mentioned, I just want to take a little bit of time at the top of this program so that Chris and I can walk you through some of the key data points and some of the key themes in the paper. It's been updated with data that's come out since the paper was published, because we all know there have been some pretty atrocious incidents happening across the country since February. So let me share my screen to begin. Okay, hopefully everyone can see. This is our speaker panel. Let me just begin with this slide on the impact of the pandemic on the Asian American community generally. The Asian American population has a higher proportion than its regular representation in the healthcare industry. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, it was really feeling the front lines of the healthcare crisis and the fear of the pandemic. And some of the anti-Asian sentiments were being directed at healthcare workers by the very patients that they were trying to help. And so that's something that we thought was worth highlighting. As well, in the New York area, there is a higher proportion of Asian shopkeepers and small business owners, a higher proportion than the representation among the general population. And as you know, the restaurant business and the small shops really felt the brunt of the economic impact as stay-at-home orders were issued. And on the anti-Asian front, as there was rhetoric going on at the beginning of the pandemic, rumors about catching the virus if you order Chinese food or talk to Chinese shopkeepers or interacted with Asians at these institutions. And so that too was one of the early experiences felt by the Asian American community, such that the unemployment rates reflect this higher impact as of April of last year in the beginning stages of the pandemic. In terms of the spike in hate incidents generally, you can see from this diagram and from reporting that's been collected by the NYPD and by community organizations that there was a huge spike in anti-Asian hate and bias incidents starting in the fourth quarter of 2019 as the pandemic was unfolding, going into the first quarter of 2020. And then it drops off a little bit, but stays relatively high compared to the sort of, 2019 norm. And a lot of that is probably tied to the stay-at-home orders, the fact that people were not on the street. So it's not a reflection of any decrease in hate. And a lot of this was, being driven by rhetoric. President Trump from the presidential podium calling it a China virus, the Kung flu, and a lot of the misinformation that was being spread across the country at the early stages of the pandemic. What's unfortunate is that there was a decrease, perhaps attributed to the stay-at-home orders, but in the early 2021 time period, we are actually seeing the data spiking back up as people are interacting more, coming out into public spaces, using public transportation and the like. There's an unfortunate rise again of these incidents. This next slide just compares the major cities in the country. And as you can see, New York is just at this extreme. The incidents have skyrocketed. The comparison between 2019 and 2020 is the greatest in New York, followed by LA, Boston, and Seattle. And we can discuss during this program why it is that New York really has so much of so many of these incidents and is feeling the brunt of this. But among other things, the public transportation element, the public space, ideal of this big city, I think has also led to a lot of public interactions and encounters. Chris, do you want to take over for a bit?
Sure. One of the things that was happening during the early stage of the pandemic was that Stop AAPI Hate, which was a creation of 3 different entities out of California, started collecting reports online. Many of these things would not have been recorded otherwise by police because they did not rise to the level of a crime or that someone would be arrested. And so, it was really interesting. A lot of them involve coughing or spitting, verbal harassment, and the police, his reaction was, well, what are we going to do? If it's verbal harassment, we can't arrest this person, so just go about your way. But Stop AAPI Hate, and I think in retrospect, and of course, AABANY knew then that they were doing really important work, was really collecting data points that would point to what was coming. We were all kind of stuck at home, come March of 2020. And so it kind of pushed out the sort of anti-Asian violence wave further out. And of course, during that period, George Floyd, whose death we remembered yesterday, occurred. And then there was a massive social movement that came as a result in the summer and for many months. And that did push the anti-Asian hate sort of off the media radar, in part, sort of pushing us to do this paper so that we would have a voice. Not that we were fighting or pushing it off, but that we wanted the Asian American sort of issue to also be remembered. And so Stop AAPI Hate was collecting data at the same time, shunning, avoidance, coughing and spitting, verbal harassment. They were huge parts of what they were collecting. And there was a very sort of, the police just didn't take it seriously, to be very honest. They just said, well, no one's dying. People are not really sort of getting hurt. So what's the big deal? I don't think they would say that explicitly, but I do think that was the unsaid sort of assessment of the situation. If we look at, sort of, what they were, verbal harassment, name calling, shunning, don't get into my cab, don't come into my store, things like that. And can we go on to the next slide?
Yep.
If we look at sort of where it comes from, it doesn't come sort of out of nowhere. It has a long legal history in America. And I'll just tell you a couple of stories in the lead up to the Chinese massacre. The Chinese started first coming in the middle of the 19th century to California, San Francisco in large numbers because of the gold rush. Immediately after they came here, America was in a process of deciding whether or not to welcome Chinese people to become part of this nation, if they were going to allow them to become citizens or to participate in civic life. And they decided the answer was no. The Chinese were in a very infamous case before the California Supreme Court, the People versus Hall. The law was that a Chinese person could not testify against a white person in court. So that white person who was found guilty of murder of a Chinese gold miner was freed. And what that did was it immunized violence against Chinese. And the statute originally applied to blacks, African Americans, Native Americans. So violence was always immunized against non-whites in our country. That was on the books. And I really think that legacy, of non-whites not being part of the legal system, not having the protections, does have a legal sort of history in our country. And even after the legal precedents and the statutes were eliminated, the social and political understanding of non-whites as being part of our country, our system, is still a work in progress. As the Chinese were here, they were subject to, wave after wave of laws. The LA massacre, 19 Chinese were murdered in retaliation because a white barkeep had been shot by a Chinese person. So they killed 10% of all the Chinese that were in the city on that day. There was laws against Chinese women coming to America. The Page Act, it saw Chinese women, as all Chinese women coming to America, as prostitutes and worthy of very strict enforcement of not letting them in. It would also not have the Chinese people here have children, leave a legacy, have a foothold in American society. And that eventually grew also to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which excluded most Chinese with like 105 quota each year. From there on, there was the Long Depression. We call it the Long Depression now, 1870 to the 1890s. And, the Chinese were really they were conditional people. They were not welcome. They wanted them to go. They would expel them from cities. They would expel them from towns. They would, during a bubonic plague outbreak, the Chinese in Chinatown was quarantined along with anyone that was Asian. If you were white but you lived within the Chinatown, they would draw the lines around you. You would not be part of the quarantine. So the identification of the Chinese with disease has a long history in this country. And so we have, often been scapegoated for any number of health issues, political issues, or economic sort of downturns. So if you can go next. And of course, as we all well know, going back to World War II, China and the US became allies, Japan became the enemy, and the Japanese Americans within American borders were put into concentration camps in America. So if we go bring it up to the 80s, you have Japan coming out of post-World War II, having enormous economic success, really devastating the American auto industry. And particularly in America's Midwest, out of Detroit, where Vincent was, out on his bachelor party, got into a fight, 2 unemployed auto workers. His death resulted in a no prison term and just a fine. And that led to a movement within the Asian American community to build legal centers, to build institutions, to advocate for the interest of Asian Americans in the legal system. Karen, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. This slide really just highlights some of the key causes and the challenges that we face as we try to address hate, not just against Asian Americans, but hate in general. And is a topic that we're going to discuss in great detail today, but just to list them off here, obviously the history of violence and hate rising when there is fear, when there's uncertainty, and when there's stress on our society. That seems to correlate throughout history, and it's a pattern that unfortunately is repeating, specific to this pandemic, but also something that's happened in the past. The spread of incomplete or inaccurate information, kind of pushing stereotypes and blame and scapegoating, is something that we saw at the beginning of this pandemic. Underreporting of incidents, something a lot of people have talked about. There is a reluctance, I think, on the part of victims to step forward, either because there are language barriers, there are cultural norms of not wanting to draw attention or to engage with law enforcement. There are immigration concerns that contribute to this. A lot has been done over the last year and a half to counter this through community activism and movements and know your rights information. But nonetheless, that there is an underreporting issue. And so even the data that we're showing you is clearly just the tip of the iceberg. Lack of cultural awareness. This is a common thing that we can talk about a little more today, but the idea that people don't always associate stereotypes, discrimination, racism with Asian Americans, that sometimes people regard it as kind of a non-issue, that Asians are model minorities or they're kind of honorary whites, and it seems to be a complete lack of cultural awareness for the history, for this sort of perpetual foreigner concept that has risen during times of fear and hate when Asians are being targeted and scapegoated. So that generally is one of the things that we're really working to improve in this country. And then there are difficult legal standards for hate crimes that sometimes causes prosecutors or law enforcement not to really pursue the hate crime enhancement. And so one of the challenges that we face is trying to work with law enforcement to push them to do more investigation and to really look at the facts of the situation and do more digging to see what the facts really bear in a particular situation. Chris, you want to talk about the different perspectives?
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to get into this during the discussion. Is that AABANY, the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force in the NYPD, was announced to great fanfare. It was an all-volunteer task force in the sense that all the police assigned to it were full-time assigned elsewhere within the NYPD and were called into something only if their language ability called for it. It also did not receive any separate funding. And we felt that both of those things, deterred it from being as more effective than it was. This ran into, of course, BLM and the defund the police movement, which is difficult to define because I think it's defined in many different ways. But there were sort of, there has been a debate, I think, within the Asian American community about sort of like how to approach policing in this issue. And I'll leave it at that. AABANY takes very seriously working, cooperating with other bar associations, particularly diverse ones, because that's really how, we do our work, how we've done our work. The report, when we were writing it, and Karen King, we put it out there to as many sort of stakeholders as we could to try to have feedback and to propose, as lawyers, workable and sensible solutions to this very sort of complex and ongoing problem that we face. It's a debate that we're still going to have because The COVID-19, Hate Crimes Act has been passed at the federal level. We think it's just a start, and it's really something that, and just also remember that although it originally began its life as the anti-Asian bill, it had to lose that to become the COVID-19 bill because they didn't want it just to be for Asian Americans or about Asian Americans. It was about COVID-19. So it's very interesting and an interesting point to keep in mind, just so that we have a fully bipartisan sort of buy-in. Can we go into the next one? And Karen, did you want me to do this or did we? Yeah.
That doesn't matter. I think we can just speak very quickly to these. I go ahead. I mean, these are the initiatives that we set forth in the paper. Many of them have actually come to fruition, which we're very proud of, including the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. But we are pushing for, better reporting and better classification and prosecution, public education, greater representation, stronger unity and collaboration, the theme of this program, as well as consideration of alternative dispute resolution for crimes that or incidents that don't have severe injury. So considering mediation and other ways of giving victims a voice and compensation where appropriate. So these are the things we kind of started the dialogue for in our paper. So I don't want to eat up more time on the paper because I think there are so many interesting issues for us to talk about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Karen Yao. But before I do that, let me read the first CLE code for this evening, which is greeting, GREETING 4306. Greeting 4306 is the first code for tonight's program. Thanks so much, Karen. You're on mute.
Thank you, Karen King, for that code. But even more importantly, thank you to you and to Chris Clark for giving us a real foundation for us to go even deeper into this conversation. So next, I want to turn to Myrna. As we have just learned from Chris and Karen, the current anti-hate incidences must be viewed in the history of race and racism in this country. So I would like Myrna to talk a little bit about what does it mean watching as a woman of color at these rising incidences against anti-Asian, and what does it really mean to be an ally to each other?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. And hopefully you can all hear me okay.
Yep, we can.
As Chris Kwok just mentioned, it seems to rotate, right? Like these incidents of hate where people take turns being hated, it looks like, in this country, unfortunately. And then you have anti-Asian hate going back, 1800, 1900. You have Black hate going back for so long. You have, anti-immigrant sentiment, which is now kind of focused on Latin America, but you also had anti-immigrant hate focused at Asians. At one point, and it sometimes continues to be that way. And that's the same way that Karen King had mentioned about this perpetual minority. Even when your family has been in the country for generations, you were born here and people still see you as other in some way. So as a woman of color looking at this, as an Afro-Latina woman who was born in another country, another immigrant myself, looking at this, for me, I see it as a need for a coalition. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about as a group is the fact that, that elephant in the room where you have other people of color who are looking at what the Asian community, AAPI community is going through right now and saying, well, you deal with it yourself because you have not been strong allies for us in the Black community, which is not necessarily true. You have, people like Grace Lee Boggs, who was a Chinese-born American woman who was really strong in the 60s and in fighting for civil rights for Black people. So, but that's something that I see often. Like whenever I mention, well, why don't you put up a post, supporting the Asian community and condemning this, I have heard from other people of color, well, why should we? Because we didn't see Asian Americans marching with us when we did Black Lives Matter. So I think that's something that needs to be broken down. We need to create that coalition. We need to be allies for each other. To the extent that we have any privilege, we need to use it so that we can speak out against hate when, like right now, where this is happening to the Asian community. Last year, it was African-American with George Floyd, a number of other African-Americans who were killed, Breonna Taylor, and continues to go forward. And I feel like we need to not just take those turns, right? Not just talk about, well, if I talk about Asian attacks, then it takes away from the Black cause, as opposed to joining hands and saying it's the same cause, right? Whatever's causing the Asian hate, that's what caused the African-American hate. That's what's caused the Latino hate. It's just hate, and you need to address it all. And we all need to be allies to each other. We need to all talk about it as much as we possibly can in programs like this and wherever we have the opportunity to do so. You're muted, Karen.
Thank you, Myrna, for those remarks. And we are going to come back to this topic of solidarity among communities of color and among all people. So the next person I would like to hear from is Kin Eng. Kin, who is with 30 years of experience as a prosecutor, has pretty much, quote, seen it all. And I will say it. Kin, the DA's offices haven't done real well by the Asian American communities, have they? We have had no successful prosecution of a single hate crime up until mid-February of this year, despite the fact that these incidences had happened in the previous 12 months. Given some very highly visible events since early and mid-March, there has been a slew of activities since then. Much progress has been made, but I can't help but ask that question. What are some of those reasons? What have you got to say for yourself?
That's tough, especially with Jen Vine on the same call too, right? And we're getting recorded. Listen, it is difficult. Why don't we just break it down from its most fundamentals, all right? Oftentimes, when you're on jury duty, the prosecutor would tell you, listen, the people doesn't have to prove motive, prove their crime, right? So, but this is different over here. When you're talking about hate crimes, motive is actually an aspect of it. So not only do we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard, it's much higher than civil cases, which is preponderance of evidence. This, for criminal cases, beyond a reasonable doubt, not only the crime itself, but the motive, that the reason why they're doing certain things is because of a particular perception, or the reason is because of a particular class of why they're doing it, they're being biased against. And in some cases, it's very difficult because there's a huge difference between, I would say, when you're selecting a crime, a victim, versus actually proving the motive itself, right? So let's say, for example, if I'm walking, coming out of an ATM, and a robber sees me and he pulls out a knife and tries to steal my money, and I'm struggling with him, right? Now, I'm Asian. Now, during the struggle, he should say, you effing chink, or something like that, get your hands off of it. And he stabs me, right? Now, is that really a hate crime? I mean, yes, I'm Asian, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a hate crime, right? Because the selection of me, just because I'm Asian, doesn't necessarily mean the motive why he picked on me was because I was Asian. It could be because he just wanted money. Or it could be as simple as something, let's say, two guys get into a fight, and in the middle of the fight, they get very angry and they start using racial slurs, right? Or something of people's sexual orientation, which happens all the time. And in that particular situation, is the reason why they targeted that person, is because of a particular perception or a particular class or group of people, right? And it's very tough, all right? That's why oftentimes, and it becomes even more tough, especially with the Asians, because there's a huge language barrier. So I could say, you effing chink, and so forth and so on. I always want to beat effing chink. But if I'm hitting a 75-year-old grandmother who doesn't speak any language, she's not gonna know why I said. So how can you really prove that, right? That's a very, very high bar sometimes. That's why there are other, it's very different from somebody drawing a swastika or hanging a noose outside someone's house. The crime itself, the act itself, is very indicative of what the intent or the mind or the motivation behind it, right? But when it comes to some of these attacks now, that's why there are other situations, right? That's why if you can remember what they said, all right, at the beginning of the act, all right, if it's recorded, obviously, and then sometimes there may be certain situations where there's a pattern of behavior, right? Robbing one Chinese delivery guy is one thing, but over a course of period of time, there's like 5 or 6, and they all happen to be Chinese delivery men, then we can establish a pattern. That's common sense, right? So yes, I understand that the public is very frustrated, as am I. But I think people also have to remember that I understand that, there is a fixation, and I'm not saying that if the application, if it applies that you can't charge it, we would definitely charge it. But keep in mind that if I'm charging somebody for murder and I can't make out the hate crimes, yes, it may elevate it just slightly, but keep in mind, murder in the second degree, you can get 25 to life, right? Or assault 1, where I take a machete and hack someone and cause a serious physical injury, you can get up to 25 years in jail, right?
So Ken, not DA Gonzalez's office. DA Gonzalez's office is extremely progressive, but is there looking more internally to the prosecutors community as a whole? How do you think the prosecutors themselves, what kind of steps could they take in order to take these anti-Asian incidences more seriously?
So I would say that I'm going to piggyback on what Ms. Santiago brought up. The key to all of this is we can't prosecute any cases without witnesses, right? That means that there has to be a collaboration, cooperation with us, PD, and the community. When there's distrust, I don't care how strong your case is, it's going down the toilet, all right? So there has to be a community, building community trust that's central to prosecuting any crimes, especially hate crimes, right? Because a witness who might have overheard something, or somebody who lives over here might have a surveillance camera that will cooperate and so forth and so on, or he might say, you know what, that same guy attacked another old Asian lady last week, all right? And then we can establish a pattern, right? These are very, very important, right? So community trust, building bridges, certainly internally. I would say that, I'm gonna start with NYPD. Listen, I'm not here to criticize NYPD, but if you're serious about hate crimes, you have to put resources in there. That's the bottom line, all right? And there can't be just somebody who just say, listen, you know what, you're a narcotics detective, you look like you're pretty good, let's go and do it, all right? It has to be people who are dedicated, who wants to do this type of work, all right? Because it involves a lot of investigative work, and also takes a certain cultural sensitivity that's involved, right? Dealing with a Chinese old lady, right? Like my mother, who doesn't want to have to do with anything, who came from communist China. They're not gonna want to deal with somebody who's not easy to deal with, all right? And I think the third part, and all of this we've been talking about, right? Because in my office, we had a huge meeting in April with community leaders, We also set up a anti-Asian task force involving leaders and coalition. I think AABANY was involved with that too. We internally set up a what we call a advisory committee for anti-Asian hate crimes. So there's about 15 of us, from very senior people like me to younger ADAs, maybe about even as young as 3 years in the office. And we're all of a particular demographic, and I would say 80% of us are bilingual. So the thing is that we can be sort of like the nexus between the community and the police and us, all right? So if somebody who doesn't trust the police, but a community leader knows me and say, hey, Ken, you know, I have this senior citizen from this center. She was just like beaten by somebody, blah, 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 blah. So listen, I'm the bureau chief. I can call up the squad. I can call up the precinct directly and say, hey, can you check this out for me? Or let's say even better, the anti-Asian hate crime task force within the NYPD. If it's well-funded, well-run, I can call them directly and we can work with them. And then we start doing investigative work. Listen, it's not rocket science, but there has to be a focus and a willingness to put resources in the people and to be able to bring a group, as Ms. Santiago said, allies, right? We need to be allies. Without being allies, the community is not going to trust us. We can't prosecute, and everything's going to fall apart.
Thank you, Ken. Those were very thoughtful remarks, and we'll come back to you a little bit later. But for now, I want to turn to Jinvin, and from the perspective of someone who is very concerned about the over-incarcerated state, right? That is United States in general, and more specifically New York City. How do you see us combating anti-Asian incidences through ways other than incarceration?
I think that, look, a lot of what Ken said, actually, I agree with. You know, there has to be a recognition that this is happening to Asians across New York, and we have to be able to provide resources and access to people who might have a language barrier. Something that I wanted to point out is that what concerns me about hate crime enhancements is the fact that it could disproportionately affect another group of minorities, right? What we might see is an over-criminalization of populations that are already Black and brown, who are already overrepresented in our jails and prisons. The other thing about hate crime enhancements and focusing on a approach that is focused around criminalization is that it obscures the issues that really cause violence. It obscures the root causes of these violence. Something that Myrna said is that the same thing that causes anti-Asian violence is the same thing that has caused anti-Black violence. And that's absolutely true. And something that we have to be really aware of is, you know, in fighting anti-Asian hate, we can't then throw, our other minority groups under the bus, people who have already been oppressed, and further oppress them as well. We have to come together and fight against the larger system, which is white supremacy. And so when we talk about that, I think what we're talking about is we have to really think about the root causes that cause this kind of violence. And a lot of that has to do with cultural awareness, has to do with educating ourselves, educating each other. You know, there is this media narrative about Black and Asian tension, but I don't think that's actually true. I think it actually really erases this really deep and, a deep and long history of solidarity between the two communities. You know, one thing I'll say is that I think it was right after the Atlanta murders, there was a very large rally that was happening in Chinatown, Manhattan, in Columbus Park. And it became even larger because activists from the BLM movement had started a march in Union Square that came down and met with the rally that was happening in Chinatown. And that's the kind of solidarity that we want to see. And many of these activists are talking about approaching this from, one that is not reflexive, but one that is, really looking at how do we prevent this violence and how do we invest in our communities. You know, Asian Americans are seen as a model minority, but many Asian Americans in New York especially are actually trapped in the cycle of violence that is poverty. And that means that we need to make sure that they have resources and affordable housing, right? You know, we talk about the violence that's been targeting a lot of our elders. Well, some of our elders are housing insecure. They're out there collecting cans so that they can put food on their table or pay rent, right? And so how do we address that violence? We have to make sure that they have affordable housing, that they're safe, that they have access to healthcare, that they have access to affordable housing, that they have access to mental health care, that they have access to language assistance. We need to make sure that they have access to all of these things in their community so that our communities can protect each other. I really do stress staying away from an approach that focuses too much on criminalization, because when we talk about the NYPD, and look, I'm not going to knock on the anti-Asian task force and the detectives that have volunteered their time outside of their full-time assignments to be a part of this task force because they care about what's happening to their community. But when we talk about NYPD as an institution, it is an institution that has been mired in racism as well. They have been found by a federal court to have engaged in racist practices with their stop and frisk policies. They have not yet been found to be in compliance with the federal monitor arising from that case. You know, as recently as earlier this year, it came out that one of the commanding officers of their own internal employment EEO, their Equal Employment Office, was posting racist, bigoted, sexist remarks on an online board, and it wasn't brought out because IAB found out. It was brought out because one of the city council members had investigated it. And so a lot of my wariness about focusing on a policing solution comes from the fact that it's not an effective solution long term. It's one that's reflexive, and I understand why we turn to it, but it's a flawed solution.
Got it. Thank you. Ken, I want to turn back to you a little bit. Colleagues of ours who are prosecutors, right, who have a tough job, like you said, prosecuting these anti-hate incidences, right, especially in ways that are sensitive, right, without just further criminalizing more people, have said that some of the recent criminal justice reform have made it harder. For example, the discovery rules, much tighter discovery rules have made it much harder to protect the identity of witnesses, right? Something that you just said, without whom prosecution would fall. So what's your point of view about whether there's any cause and effects between the recent criminal justice reform and the current prosecution of anti-hate incidences? Ken?
So obviously those the new discovery laws are relatively new, right? And obviously from a direct point of view, is a lot more stressful because the amount of work is just at least triple, right? Because you're within a certain period of time, you need to produce certain type of documents. And keep in mind, as time progresses, there's always more stuff going on because when I first started, there was no body-worn cameras. Now every single person has a body-worn camera, and we have to turn that over within a certain period of time. Now we have to do certain things to it, right? We besides looking at it, sometimes if there are civilians involved, we also, who are not involved, who appear on the camera, we may have to black those out. Listen, I'm not here to really sort of critique what the legislature decided to do, because that's what they voted to do, and we're going to comply. But I would say that depending on the crime, keep in mind. So let's just take it from an anti-Asian hate crime point of view, right? Let's say, for example, if my mother was a victim of a crime, let's say a robbery, and so forth. So she goes and meets an ADA. She gets a social worker, and during the conversation, they're going to say, listen, eventually, the defense attorney has a right to actually give you a call, and call you up or email you, contact you directly. For some people they might not be very happy with that, right? And it may have a chilling effect. There are others who are completely fine with it. Now, keep in mind that, there's a reason why there's an underreporting of crimes among the immigrant population, right? Because there are all these lack of understanding about what the criminal justice system is all about. So when you impose these additional, I'm not going to say hurdles, but these more things that they have to get involved. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't get involved, because if you're going to accuse somebody, the defendant has a full right to defend themselves. But it does have an effect. I mean, you can definitely see that, right? And let's say taking, or let's say, for example, if someone burglarized my house, I mean, part of the statute is it allows the defense to come to the crime scene, which is your house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So listen, I mean, it is what it is. It is something that we have to deal with, and
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.
So, Jandine, I'm going to come back to you. As I was getting more and more involved in Albany's task force, and I should preface, and I have my own biases, right? In this case, I am someone who's concerned about the over-incarcerated state. But as I get more and more involved in the task force, I hear these incidences, right? For example, someone was harassed in the early part of the lockdown in 2020. And it was considered a misdemeanor. And I was told that it's because of the criminal justice reform. He was given a desk appearance ticket and didn't get a hearing until the fall, many months later, until the fall. And during that period of time, there was no order of protection between the victim and between the alleged perpetrator. And even as I was listening to this story, as I sit there, I had to say, that's kind of chilling. If I live in the same community as the alleged perpetrator, I don't know if I want to keep running into him. So what do you think about that? Did I just get it wrong? Or is there some truth to it? Or is it overblown? What's your point of view?
I think that, I mean, if I'm understanding, the concern is kind of twofold. One is that the suspect or the alleged defendant was back in the community because of bail reform. And then the second aspect is like this order protection. So I'm going to kind of address it backwards because I just mentioned the order protection. Orders of protection are I mean, they're good because they're ordered by the court, and they get, I know that they probably give some people some sense of security. But the reality is that if someone's going to violate an order of protection, they're going to violate an order of protection. And if they do violate that order of protection, if you call the cops on them, they're going to get arrested, they're going to come back, and under the bail reform statutes, they're going to have a hearing based on whether or not they, should have bail set. But the other aspect of bail reform that I think we should talk about is, the bail reform laws were good. There's a reason why we needed to reform our bail laws, because they were operating in a way that was disproportionately affecting indigent and mostly Black and brown New Yorkers. And so what I have to say is this, is that the perpetrator was wealthy, they would have been out anyway. And so what does that say about safety, except that it's a false sense of security then if you're talking about we should have kept them in. But what we're saying is this person is legally innocent. And so we have to balance those two those two sides out, And as far as an order of protection goes, if a victim wants an order of protection, more often than not, in my experience, the prosecutor's office asks for it and the court grants it. And there really isn't usually much else that a defense attorney could really do about it, right? If the prosecutor asks for it, the judge normally will grant it. And so I'm not really sure exactly what happened in that example that you cited, but that's been my experience. So I'm not really sure. But, and again, when it comes to actual safety issues though, and I understand it's not a satisfying answer because it doesn't offer like an immediate sense of security, that's not going to be what that's not going to grant, order protection is not going to grant us in our community, long-term public safety. If we want long-term public safety, we still have to address these root causes of that kind of violence and that kind of hate and bias to begin with.
Got it. Thank you for that.
Karen,
I'm
I
going
think,
to ask one more. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Just to address sort of, that the AT situation, I think it was really sort of, it could have been because of the pandemic, right? Because usually what happens is that when you give somebody a DAT, is usually for lower level crimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And usually they don't see the judge until like at least a month or so later. But because of the pandemic, 1 or 2 months winded up stretching into like several months or even longer. So until you see the judge, there can't be an order of protection being issued. So there's two issues, right? One is the pandemic stretching it out long. And then two, if maybe that was one of those cases where they shouldn't have issued the DAT. But it could have happened because during the pandemic, nobody knew what was going on, right? And and it's difficult to really talk about each case is so different. And sometimes, even with the best intentions and all the facts that we have at our disposal, we get it wrong. We get it wrong.
Got it. All right. I am going to turn from criminal prosecution of these anti-hate incidences and more long-term solution to this this hate to the public impressions of these incidences. My friend Chris Clark has been talking to the media on behalf of the Asian American Bar Association and on behalf of the task force combating anti-Asian hate quite a lot. And I like to turn to him and ask him, what has he learned from all those experiences speaking with the media, both domestically and internationally, about being an Asian American and about these anti-Asian hate and violence?
Thanks, Karen. It's almost like since February of this year, which is when there was the Klieg light of like media attention turned on this issue. Every month has been like slightly different. And I like to sort of take you guys with me through sort of February. In February, when we were talking to, the mainstream media, anything that we would think of as like, everyday knowledge, like contained within the report that we put out was really news to them, and I was just like, oh, this is really easy. I'm just telling them like ABCs 101s, we kind of knew they didn't know, which is why we wrote about it and put it down. But, maybe you hope like you put it out and people be like, oh, yes, I know all about this. I need to know even more, but that wasn't the case. It was just like, all right, I'm just going to recite 101 Asian America, right? And be like, okay, I knew it was marginal, but oh yeah, this is pretty marginal. But then I also was very pleased that the Klieg light of the media, because now I felt in the middle of it, I was like, oh, this is how it feels to be in the mainstream. The things I think about are being discussed. The ideas we've talked about over and over in the same way for 40 years are being challenged, rethought, made more complex, more nuanced. I was like, this is good. This is what it means to be there and to have everyone in the same boat and to be like, what can we do about this problem? Like, that's what it felt like. We were pushed forward by many Asian Americans in media who were, like 5 to 10 years in their career. And they really pitched, like their newsrooms to have these stories. Like before that, they would do it once in a while and maybe they would get the story. But now, like, you turn around and New York Times gonna have like 7 stories on Asian Americans. So that was really something new. As we got through the first month, like, who's happening? Why is this happening? This is so shocking. It was really like, is this really that bad? We're not really sure. It's a nonprofit. Stop AAPI hate collecting. Is it really that bad? And the Atlanta really changed the story and how it was covered because it seemed to kick it up to another notch about death, right? Before it was like spitting, pouring drinks, people being harassed, verbal harassment. Is it really so bad? No one explicitly said that, but I believe that was the general take on it. But I think that after Atlanta and the deaths, it really turned up the tenure of the coverage on it in a way. It was taken much more seriously. And it was also, of course, traumatic for the Asian American population, and particularly women, Asian American women, because of the gendered nature of the harassment, and then eventually violence, right, and death. Speaking to international media was also very interesting, because I think some of the more sort of like Black versus Asian narrative carries a lot more further, because it's going outside of the border of our country, and that was sort of the tenor. And yeah, no, actually I totally agree. The coverage for the first day of the Atlanta, particularly for the first 6 hours, because I was following it very closely, was really disturbing, and something that the newsrooms just took the police department. The Cherokee's Sheriff's Department was the main culprit, that took the word. And not only did they take the word from the podium, they actually put out press release quoting the killer, the accused killer, which I have. Like they took time to actually like tap that out, which was really incredible. But and I remember being really upset like the first 8 hours, and I was talking to all these press people like, this is crazy, this is unacceptable. But even though the first 8 hours was really terrible, they really did course correct. Maybe not nearly as much as they should have, not nearly as much as we want them, but there was course correction within the newsrooms about that. And but and this is back to the original point about international coverage. That story then goes into the international coverage outside of this country, and it misses the nuance, it misses the pushback, and that becomes the story. And the other part of the story that becomes part of the international is the Black versus Asian narrative. Or most of the international coverage kind of accepted that, I think, without really too much critical sort of like look. It was really interesting talking at the same time to national versus international. So it was a crash course on sort of like watching perceptions, experiencing it, hearing questions, and then knowing what people didn't know and knowing what I needed to tell them. But then also set me on sort of more research, on more avenues of understanding my own experience and part of the larger Asian American experience, to be able to respond in real time, to be able to educate our community, but then also the outside community and myself. So it's been a really incredible sort of journey to talk about all these issues: permanent, forever foreigner, model minority. I've always talked about it only in my ethnic studies classes or pretty specific spaces, but to be talking about it on national media, was like, oh, this is now here. Yeah.
So the proverbial, a crisis produces opportunity. This has produced an opportunity for all of us to talk about these issues that are very close to our heart, that have been happening, and re-emerging. And it gives us a chance, like you said, to be in the mainstream, if for only a moment in time.
Yeah.
At this point, I want to open it up to the audience. We have a great turnout tonight. We have over 50 participants on this call. And I know that many of you do this work as well. I would love to have you post questions. If you type it into the chat, I will read it to the panelists. Or this is actually not, this is a event in which you can actually unmute yourself and speak. So if you want to, you can actually just ask the questions if you like. Myrna, do you have a thought to share or a question to ask?
I did, Karen. I just wanted to point out that Scott Carson, the president of the New York State Bar Association, is on, and I see him on camera.
Yes.
So, being that you just opened it up for the audience, I don't know if Scott wants to say a few words.
We are looking forward to having President Carson to give our closing remarks this evening. So I'm happy to have President Carson say anything, that he would like, but we are also looking forward to having him talk So please don't go away. All right. Any questions? Okay. So I want to turn back to Myrna. Myrna, you and I have worked in galvanizing communities of color to work together.
Mhm.
And I definitely think that this, rivalry or the tension between Asian Americans and Blacks is overblown.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, I think it's also real,
Mhm.
right? Because, as Genevieve said, if there is greater criminalization of these anti-Asian hate crimes, we do risk, throwing more people of color into jail, and particularly young people of color.
Mhm.
So how do we go about this hard work of creating community? Give us some concrete suggestions, a few concrete suggestions.
I think, I'm not sure who was it that mentioned it. I think it actually was Genevieve who mentioned the fact that we need to educate people. I think the same way that the media has worked up this narrative about this rivalry between the Asian community and the other Black and Brown communities, about the fact that, Asians are the model minorities and why can't you all be like Asians, conveniently forgetting the history of Asians and how they were also brutalized and discriminated against in this country. And we're sort of buying into it. I see the community sort of buying into it, where you see the things happening in the street and people just kind of shrugging it off like, well, our lives didn't matter, so why should we care about yours? As opposed to, well, we should be working on these issues together. And I think, one of the things that I always tell people when you're trying to be allies is you have to sit in your discomfort about certain issues, right? So when I talk to someone and that's their immediate response, well, I don't care about the Asian hate because, I'm struggling with my own issues as a Black person or Hispanic person. I always talk about interrupting bias with the question why, right? So for me, it's just, okay, why did you say that? Why do you feel like it's an Olympics, that there's a race that it's either Black or it's Asians or it's Latinos, as opposed to us working together and trying to get to the same place where all of our lives matter, right? Where none of us are getting killed in the street, where none of us are getting overly incarcerated. So, and people have a struggle with that. We're trying to sit in that discomfort and just try to work through some of their biases, because that's what it is. It's a bias. Right? So it's about getting educated, about teaching people. A friend of mine just this week told me about Grace Lee Boggs. And she said, did you know that in the 60s, the Asian communities actually came out and they marched for civil rights for Black people? They were out there, knocking on doors and making sure that petitions were signed. They were getting gassed and hosed just like us. She's like, read up on Grace Lee Boggs, which I did. Watch the documentary. And, the fact that she married a Black man and was in a Black community. And it's, that's the sort of thing that we need to do, is we need to keep reading, we need to keep educating, we need to keep reaching out to people in different communities. And listen, right? We have to listen to each other and we have to practice empathy. Like for me, as I always say, I am a Black Latina immigrant from another country, right? So I have a whole burden, a whole bag of things that I'm carrying around all the time. And I have empathy for other people who may have other things that they're carrying around as well. So for me, when I first started seeing these incidents happen, and I think Chris was the one who mentioned that it was only until February that the national media picked this up. And yet you have, Stop Asian Hate Reporting Center, who says that 3,300 of these incidents had happened in 2020. No one picked it up. And in my mind, it was like, no one really cared, right? And if you think about that, when you think about how the community actually feels about that, when you talked about, I'm not sure, I think it was Karen who talked about some of the language barriers or the fact that people are sitting in the community and just thinking the police don't care if I got spit on or if I got kicked, because it doesn't rise to the level of a serious crime and they have other things they want to think about, and it's not me. So, you really have to practice that empathy and then put yourself in the place of someone who is being marginalized, who's being terrorized, and think to yourself, okay, how can I help? How can I be an ally? What can I do? How can I amplify your voice? What can I sign? Is it a petition? Is it a march with you? What can I do? Because that's the question.
Erin, it's Margaret Ling. Could I say a couple of words to follow Myrna?
Absolutely, Margaret. Go ahead.
I am just so thrilled that we're doing this today, and Myrna's taken the lead, that we do have to be allies and we have to collaborate. And all of you know, this whole month has not just been a celebration of Asian heritage, which usually is a wonderful celebration. It's been every day of me talking about racism, educating people, what we have to do to work together. So I want to cite, I think many of you know me, I belong to 9 bar associations, and since Black Lives Matter, and it's over a year because George Floyd was yesterday, and I was on the NYSBA lobby day yesterday talking about it, I have deliberately been active in other non-Asian bar associations so they can see I'm the only, and I am the first and the only Asian there. So we understand each other and we work together. And Myrna is absolutely correct. Empathy and listen. And I want to just say, we're going to get something out of this. Ken was talking about collaborating community. We're lawyers. I said it at NYSBA yesterday. We have to be the advocates. We're smart enough to make the change and speak up and make the difference. And I just want to talk about my experience this year. I was so touched because of all I did after Black Lives Matter that when Atlanta hit, so many friends of mine from the bar associations who were not Asian called me immediately. What can we do? Are you okay, Margaret? Because they know that I'm pretty open about what I'm saying. That this is our moment and we have to speak up. So I just wanted to make that remark. I am confident with all of this strong leadership today, and we're lawyers. We just have to get past all we are really angry. I will admit to that. I'm very angry every day and it's exhausting. Let's try to move it forward. And I think a lot of good things are happening. And I just wanted to put that in and say thank you to everybody today for doing this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was really very, very sweet. Thank you. I want to turn back to some of our panelists and ask some questions that others have raised. So Ken and the rest of the panelists too. Ken, you were the one who raised, for Asian Americans, to prove the motive behind a hate crime may be a higher bar, because unlike some insignia or symbols that are now very much accepted, right, to be a derogatory sign like a swastika. Asian Americans don't really have that symbols yet, or don't have that symbols, period. Do you think that would be helpful? How do you think having that kind of symbol, which would automatically, right, give a hate crime enhancement, could be helpful or not?
So I myself do not obviously know of a specific, let's say, a symbol or some kind of act that specifically points to, and keep in mind, right, when we're talking about Asian, there's all these different, cultures. Is very, very tough, even within for myself, who's Chinese American, within the Chinese cultures, there's all these different provinces, different cultures and customs. It's just difficult. I think, again, look, if something comes that are new, that people are not aware of, I think actually what Myrna Santiago mentioned again, and what Jen Vine had mentioned about education. I mean, listen, it's not unusual for us to have an expert in a particular case to come in and explain the ramifications of what this particular crime means. Or, I have prosecuted a case in which specific elderly Chinese women were targeted for the blessing scams. And that's a very specific type of scam directed at a particular culture, right? And the vulnerabilities of elderly women. So, you know, our arresting officer that was involved was very much in tune with that. And he was able to explain at length about what this particular symbol or what these acts meant. And I think we can still do the same thing. You know, I don't think it's unreachable. It just takes more work. And again, it goes back to really effort and how much we are willing to kind of put into this whole thing. I think in any of these goals.
Yep, got it. Another possible solution that I read recently is that some legislators have proposed that all convicted perpetrators of these hate crimes ought to receive counseling. And perhaps the counseling should come from the victims, so survivors of these hate incidences. What do you all think about that? No?
I'm
Myrna?
not sure you're going to get many volunteers from victims to help the perpetrators. I mean, it's a lovely idea, but I'm not sure of the practical reality of that. If many of these victims won't even step up to make the complaint, I don't know that they're going to want to interact. Although counseling in general, and it doesn't have to be the victim. I mean, I think education, as everyone has said, is really a critical piece of the solution here. And certainly in the same way you have anger management counseling, you can certainly have counseling to better understand the people around you and the diversity of the city and the virtues of all of that.
Right. Myrna, thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it really shouldn't be the burden of the victims to try to rehabilitate the person who's just attacked them, right? I think the counseling idea is sound. And I will go back to what Jen Bean said, that I don't think it helps anyone to incarcerate or just make the situation worse when it comes to people who are clearly hurting themselves. But to put that onus on the victim, I don't think it's the right way to go.
There is so much to talk about. For example, we haven't delved into the role mental illness have played, right, or homelessness have played in the increasing incidences of anti-Asian hate, and we're coming to the end of the hour. So instead of me asking any more questions, I wanted to leave it to our 5 panelists if you have any last comments to make before I turn this over to President Carson.
Yeah, I mean, I really, you know, Myrna's statements, I really agree with. Constant self-education is really important. You know, I minored in Asian American Studies, graduated in '96, and never heard about Grace Lee Boggs. You know, she really got famous when the documentary came out about her and became, you know, widely seen. She herself never saw herself as part of the Asian American movement. She was actually part of the Black Power movement and the Black Power intellectual class based out of Detroit, which was very, it was critical. But if you look at it, the Asian American movement, which began in Northern California, actually drew inspiration from the Black Power movement and from, which then came from the Civil Rights movement and was involved with the anti-Vietnam War protests. So actually Grace Lee Boggs was, if you draw the lens wide enough, actually part of the Asian American movement. She just never saw herself there. She was really deeply ensconced within the African American sort of like, you know, sort of Black Power, and then growing from that in Detroit. And I think that's just a long way of saying is like, things don't often, they take time to surface because we're not part of the mainstream. So you don't have that sort of speed. We have to look for our stories. We have to connect them. We have to be curious. We have to have all those things in order to teach ourselves the things that are not readily taught to us, and have our eyes open and always be curious.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
I would say that as
yeah, Karen first and then Ken.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. I was just going to make the comment that the image that really sticks in my mind as I've been doing a lot of these presentations is the image of Martin Luther King marching in Selma wearing a Hawaiian lei around. And that kind of unity and symbolism of love is really, I think, the lasting image that we should try to aspire to. And before Kin goes, why don't I read the last code for our CLE presentation?
Yes.
The last code is column COLUMN 2918, column 2918. Thanks so much.
All right. So Ken, if you could make your comment in less than a minute, then
Yes,
you can absolutely go ahead.
I really think that it's very important that we encourage everybody, no matter who it is, in terms if they've been a victim of a biased incident or crime, to report it. You know, most of the time, somebody, my mom would say, you know, why bother? It's not worth the time and so forth. They have to report it. We need those numbers, because otherwise we will be ignored. It's very, very important. If we don't see this, they're not going to do anything. You know, that comes with every part of the government. So, you know, you have to complain. You have to speak up as much as possible, no matter how insignificant it may sound like. It's important. That's all.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. President Carson, would you please make the closing remarks for all of us this evening?
Thank you very much, and I will be happy to do so. I want to first extend greetings to all who are participating in this very worthwhile endeavor, and to thank you for inviting me to participate and to contribute, albeit in some small way, to the very important work that you folks are carrying on. My name is Scott Carson. I am the 123rd president of the New York State Bar Association. And that's the largest voluntary state bar association in the United States. We have some 70,000 members. And I know for a fact that many of our members are Asian American, although I don't have figures to give to you this evening. But I am confident of that fact. I will be president for the next 5 days. On June 1st, my friend and colleague T. Andrew Brown of Rochester, New York, will assume the presidency of the New York State Bar Association. Again, thank you for inviting me this evening to join you as you examine and explore the scourge of anti-Asian hate and violence that exists in the United States. This afternoon, when I was asked to deliver remarks this evening, the first thing I did was to go back and to look at statements that have been issued by the New York State Bar Association, by the president of the New York State Bar Association, and to find statements that we were called upon to address the scourge of anti-Asian hate and violence. And I found that during the past 2 years, my predecessor, Hank Greenberg, and I issued at least 3 public statements decrying this horrible phenomenon. The first occurred in March of 2020, when Hank issued a statement. This was back when there was bias incidents, as they were called then, relating to the coronavirus that were aimed at persons of Asian descent, and who were being blamed somehow for the coronavirus, as many of you will recall. And regrettably, that kind of horrible conduct was encouraged by our leadership in Washington, which made things only worse. The second public statement that I issued in March of 2021, New York State Bar Association president condemns wave of Asian American hate crimes. And this was issued by me immediately after the horrific events in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'll just read you a bit of it. New York State Bar Association President Scott M. Carson issued the following statement today. These brutal murders in Georgia targeting members of the Asian American community should outrage all who believe in inclusiveness, a bedrock American ideal. And I'll just depart from the language from it. You remember that initially it was not certain whether or not the police would regard these horrific events as hate crimes. So what I wrote was, regardless of whether authorities determined that these abhorrent attacks were hate crimes, they were without a doubt senseless acts of violence that have robbed Asian Americans of their right to feel safe and secure in their homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the Georgia killings were not isolated incidents. Attacks against Asian Americans, including homicides, assaults, and harassment, have spiked across the nation, including here in New York, and they continue to this day. The third statement that I issued, well, the second statement that I issued came in March of 2021, shortly after the Georgia killings and on the heels of the Boulder, Colorado supermarket shooting that occurred shortly thereafter. Now, this one was addressed to the senseless killing, but also addressed to the need for gun control, which has been a policy of the New York State Bar Association for many years. And so what I wrote was, as president of the New York State Bar Association, I find myself called upon once again to express our collective sorrow at the senseless killings that have occurred within just 1 week in Boulder, Colorado, and Atlanta, Georgia, due to the scourge of gun violence. These tragic events serve as a grim reminder that gun violence in the U.S. is out of control. I ask myself, how many more expressions of sympathy will I have occasion to issue before some meaningful action is taken to address this terrible problem? We call on Congress to truly represent the American people who have said in poll after poll that they favor stricter gun control measures. The New York State Bar Association joins with President Joe Biden in urging Congress to ban large capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition and to enact universal background checks for all gun sales. So you can see that in a relatively short period of time, the New York State Bar Association reacted publicly through its leadership to decry the kinds of violence that we've seen, both aimed at Asian Americans and others as well, and all too often involving the use of firearms, which just compounds the horrific nature of these acts. As my friend, I'm sorry, did somebody say something?
Yes, it's Karen Yao. President Carson, thank you so much for your remarks. Would you please finish it?
Okay, thank you. I simply want to congratulate you for taking on this task, and I call upon all lawyers and all bar associations to join in this undertaking and to do what they can, both individually and collectively, to combat this terrible scourge. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I wish you a good evening.
President Carson, the New York State Bar Association, your former, the former president, Greenberg, and people like Myrna and Margaret and Ernesto have been great allies. And without them, this program wouldn't have been able to be developed. And that is also true with our friends at the New York City Bar Association. Thank you so much to Brett and to all of our colleagues from the New York City Bar Association who helped us develop this program. Before we go, I wanted to just let you know about Asian American Bar Association's continued commitment to fight the anti-Asian racism. And one program we have developed is the Hate Eradication Rapid Response Team. And that team is full of volunteers, attorney volunteers, some of whom have language skills to support community members who have faced anti-Asian bias incidences, so that they could, as Kin asked all of us to do, report the incidences and go through the prosecution of these incidences, and to encourage broader solutions besides criminalization and incarceration, and take into consideration potential solutions like counseling. If there are community members that you know who could use this assistance, please contact us. Please contact us at AA Anti-Asian Violence Task Force, AAVTF at aabany.org. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Take care.